I won't bother introducing Diana. I think everybody here knows her. So over to you.
All right. So this is a talk that I presented at my friend has this event that she does every month. So there's this thing called Death Jam, but it's based off a model which is the Death Cafe, where people get together to talk about death. And she started this thing called Death Jam, which is a death themed talks. And so she said, "Can you do something on something that has relevant to discuss and relevant to death?" And I came out with cannibalism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about human and non-human cannibalism, and why we think that cannibalism is as rare in humans as it is, or not that rare, as the case may be. So what is cannibalism? Cannibalism can be any eating of somebody of the same species. So in zoology, it's like any conspecific. But cannibalism has been recorded for more than 1,500 species. It's especially prevalent among aquatic species, with 90% of organisms engaging in some kind of cannibalism. It's not restricted to carnivores, and it also happens in herbivores. And for in some species, like dragonflies, something like 95% of mortality is due to cannibalism. Now, cannibalism is kind of a strange word. The word cannibalism is a mispronunciation of the Carib people. Columbus went and met the Arawak people, and they said, "Oh, there are these Carib people that are on the other side of the island, and they engage in cannibalism," which is a little bit ironic because they probably didn't engage in cannibalism, and there probably were no Carib people at all. So that's where the word cannibalism comes from. So any eating is conspecific. There's also anthrophagy. Anthrophagy is eating another human. That's humans eating humans. There's also autophagy and autosarcophagy, which is eating oneself. So that would be like eating your fingernails, or your. There are people who have pain disorders where they don't experience pain, and what happens to them a lot of times is they end up eating off parts of their face because they don't feel any pain. Also, autophagy. There's this case of a prisoner in Georgia. I think he ate both of his own eyeballs. I guess he didn't have lunch at his seminar either. There's also cannibalism in non-human animals that I'm going to be talking about a bit more. So what is sexual cannibalism? This is not sexual cannibalism, although you might think it is. This is a really strange and misguided ad for PETA about all animals have the same parts with Pamela Anderson, renowned vegan. But cannibalism occurs a lot of times in insects and in arachnids. Conspecifics are the best multivitamin. So any other animal of your own same species is going to have the same nutrients that you have and that you need. And there's a lot of hypotheses for why sexual cannibalism exists. So sexual cannibalism is where a female will eat a male of her same species, often who's coming to court her. So one of them, and they're not all mutually exclusive. There's one called the adaptive foraging hypothesis, and what females are doing is they're trading off the value of a male as a mate versus as a food source. So the male comes to visit, and she says, "Would you be more useful as a nutrient or as a mate? Let me think about that." So that's the adaptive foraging hypothesis. There's another one, and there's some evidence for that because in females who tend to eat males who engage in sexual cannibalism, they have better fecundity, they often lay more eggs, they are in better condition. And so if a female's starving, really a male who comes to court her might be better as a food source than as a mate. It just depends, though, on also how many males that she can expect are going to come visit her, because you don't want to eat the only male that comes to visit you. That would definitely reduce your reproductive success. Also, there's the aggressive spillover hypothesis. So in some females, they become really aggressive with their prey. That's how fast they lunge at prey. And females can become especially aggressive if there's like a lot of other females in the same area and there's a lot of competition. So there's some evidence that females who are more aggressive are more likely to engage in sexual cannibalism. And then finally, there's just the mistaken identity hypothesis, which is where females will cannibalize a male because they don't know or they don't wait long enough to figure out if it's a male who's come to court her, or if it's a male, or if it's a member of a different species that's a normal prey item for her. So because of sexual cannibalism, because females often eat males in these different species, there's been some sort of coevolutionary arms race where the males will engage in behavior to try to avoid getting eaten while still managing to mate. In this mantis species, this giant mantis species up in the upper left, what the male will do, and this is actually a tactic used in a bunch of different species, what the male will do is he'll try and sneak up on the female, like kind of come around back and mate with her in a sneaky way before she knows what's going on so that he won't get eaten. In this mantis species, it's especially interesting because they actually use the sound of the wind to mask their sound when they're coming around, so they'll be coming, like kind of sneaking around. In many spider species, they do a courtship dance, which is often kind of a courtship vibration. So they'll come up to the web and then they strum out sort of a rhythm on the web itself to let the female know, I'm a male of your same species, I'm not a prey item. This is the Australian redback spider. This is kind of an unusual case. The male actually maybe wants to be cannibalized. There's a stereotype behavior that they engage in where after they mate, the male actually does a somersault and backflips into the female's mouth. And it's funny because he seems to be a little bit ambivalent about getting eaten. So he will backflip into the like to sort of do a somersault into the female's mouth, but then she's eating him and he's still kind of struggling to get away. So it seems to be sort of a not entirely completed adaptation. I've said it would be really great if you could make this adaptation for food animals. Like if you could make food animals, if it's adapted to get eaten, then maybe it would be pleasurable to be consumed by another organism. And then maybe you could actually make animals that want to be eaten. But even the spiders don't really seem to want to be eaten that much. In the orb-weaving spider, this is an orb-weaving spider male, and they do this thing called mate binding. So he has this special silk that's sort of impregnated with pheromones, and for some reason, I'm not entirely sure, it has this relaxing effect on the female. So the male will weave this silk around the female, and then she's much less likely to eat him after mating. So in between bouts of mating, he kind of does this soothing little dance on her. And you can see in a lot of spider species, the male is going to be like a lot bigger than the female. There's also sibling cannibalism and embryophagy. Embryophagy is the eating of other embryos. Or sibling cannibalism occurs in a lot of different species, and embryophagy is eating other embryos. And in the sand tiger shark, which I'm going to show you a clip of in a second, what they find is that the female will conceive a number of offspring, but then when she finally gives birth, there's just only one left. And what happens is the offspring in her womb, the one who hatches out of his egg sac first, starts to eat all the other ones. But they have found something interesting, that when she gives birth to 2 or more offspring, they tend to actually be full siblings as opposed to half siblings. So the female sand tiger shark will mate with a variety of different males, but somehow, they're not exactly sure how, the offspring can tell who are their full sibs from their half sibs, potentially. This is a really
Its cousin, the sand tiger shark, has evolved a far more extreme response to a dwindling food supply. Embryonic cannibalism. When its own yolk sac runs dry, a sand tiger embryo, no longer than a human finger, will rely on hunting instinct and a set of tiny, primitive teeth. These are no milk teeth. They are for killing. Sand tigers produce 1 or 2 embryos every day. After the eldest grows its teeth, it begins to hunt down its brothers and sisters. Although blind, the shark can sense his younger siblings. Before they can pose a threat, It's time for a series of preemptive strikes. The once crowded womb has become home to just a single living embryo. Now there's food aplenty. It can gorge at will on their yolks and their remains.
So,
From this point on, the mother will produce no further embryos. Instead, all her resources go to her surviving offspring.
so I don't know how they get that kind of footage. I'm not really sure if I want to know how. But that's sibling cannibalism. So there's also infanticide and filial cannibalism. And filial cannibalism is a type of size-structured cannibalism. So size-structured cannibalism is simply where members of a species that are larger tend to eat members of the same species that are smaller. So as I mentioned before, cannibalism can be responsible for a lot of mortality. On the low end, cannibalism is responsible for about 8% of mortality in Belding's ground squirrels, but about 95% in dragonfly larvae. And as I mentioned before, conspecifics are a really good multivitamin. In a bad reproductive environment, if you eat your offspring, cannibalism is a good way of recouping your reproductive investment. This is a famous painting of Kronos eating his offspring. This is a golden hamster, and hamsters are really well known for eating their offspring. Females can give birth to really huge litters, sometimes 20. And what they tend to do is they will cull the smaller and the weaker and the sicker ones as a way of making their litter size more manageable. So I worked next to a laboratory at University of Texas at Austin, where if the females had given birth to a litter of more than 16, the lab technicians would actually just go ahead and cull the litter themselves so that the female wouldn't. Also, there is a hypothesis that animals engage in filial cannibalism or eating their own young as a way of preventing disease from spreading. So there's one offspring who is diseased, and the female will eat that one to prevent disease from spreading to her other offspring. And there's some limited evidence for that. Also, there's some evidence of filial cannibalism and cannibalism in monkeys. So it was a terrible case in which there were monkeys being shipped, and the crate was out for too long, and the capuchins and marmosets started to engage in cannibalism. But carrying females, like animals that often care for their young, like bank voles, the house finch, and the wolf spider, often consume their young. And there's some trade-offs as to when one should consume one's young and when one shouldn't. So in the flower beetle, what they found is that there's obviously a trade-off of consuming larval beetles and then the possibility that you're going to consume your own young. So what they found is that in some species, once the animals are sexually mature, like in flower beetles, then they stop consuming their own young because there's just too much of a trade-off. There's too great a likelihood that they're going to eat their own offspring. There's also cannibalism that's been reported in chimpanzees. Both of these pictures are chimpanzees eating colobus monkeys. Am I pronouncing that right? Is it colobus? Colobus monkeys. And so there's been some evidence of juvenile males eating colobus monkeys. Eating infants. And I think that this might, just my own hunch, I think this might have to do with mistaken identity, because there has been cases of chimps eating a colobus monkey and then alternately sort of playing with it, grooming it, and then eating it. So it seems like among juvenile males, they may not really fully know the difference between a young chimp necessarily, and a monkey. But there was a fairly, go ahead.
Sorry, no, that's just not true.
Okay, so what do you think?
They feed on colobus monkeys.
Yeah, they feed on colobus monkeys, but why would they eat a baby chimpanzee?
Because, they do it for all sorts of reasons. Aggression, infanticide, because it's not their offspring, there's many reasons.
Yeah, I know there might be many reasons, but why? So this only happened like once or twice that they've actually eaten, like where they found juvenile males eating baby chimps. So I'm just saying that there could be a case of mistaken identity in this particular instance of them eating baby chimps. I'm not saying that that's like, I know that they eat colobus monkeys. I'm not saying that that's a case of mistaken identity.
But you're saying that you think when they're eating baby chimpanzees, they're mistaking that for colobus?
Yeah, that's what I think.
It's very unlikely.
Okay. So there was a famous case of Jane Goodall finding that there's these two females named Palm and Passion, and for about 10 years, during the 4-year period between 1974 and 1978, 10 infants were born into the study community at Gombe, but only one survived. And that's because this mother and daughter were eating all of the infants in the group. But what ended up happening was when the daughter, I think that was Palm, ended up pregnant and having a baby of her own, then they stopped cannibalizing the infants in the study community. And that's one of the cases in which Jane Goodall apparently got involved, where she saw them chasing after, about to eat an infant, and she shouted at them. But I don't think it actually saved the infant in the long term. Another interesting thing about cannibalism and chimps eating monkeys is that there's some possibility that might be the origin of HIV. So they think that potentially simian immunodeficiency virus recombined in a chimp who had eaten 2 different species of monkeys. And that sort of genetic swap was how HIV came to be. There's also some evidence. This is a really funny picture. So there's a guy who wrote this book, Vendramini, which is called Them and Us, which posits this ludicrous hypothesis that Neanderthals raped human women and ate humans preferentially over everything else, and that they look like this, which there's not really any evidence for at all. But there is evidence of Neanderthal cannibalism. They're not really exactly sure when you see humans that are dead or Neanderthals that are dead, like in big piles with scratch marks, or where the marrow has been extracted, like in this case with this jawbone. It's not entirely clear if it was a human that eating other humans, Neanderthals eating other Neanderthals, humans eating Neanderthals, or Neanderthals eating humans. The only way to be able to tell if a Neanderthal was killed by a human and potentially cannibalized is if there's some kind of evidence for human tools on the bones or through the cut marks. But there's a famous site called El Sidron, where it's 12 Neanderthal individuals, and they were thought to have been eaten, like a whole family. And this is one of the jaws from El Sidron. So this is this kind of sketchy evidence about Neanderthals killing and eating humans and vice versa. So next I'm going to talk about anthrophagy, which is humans eating other humans. And there's a taxonomy of cannibalism. The main divider in cannibalism is exocannibalism and endocannibalism. So exocannibalism is eating members of outside your own in-group, whereas endocannibalism is eating members within your own in-group. And people have come up with a variety of different taxonomies of cannibalism. There's ritual cannibalism, revenge cannibalism, survival cannibalism, and also some pathological anthrophagy, which you would say something like serial killing. But one of the big questions is how widespread has human cannibalism been? So there's a lot of historical examples of cannibalism, but there's a brief overview of the controversy surrounding whether or not certain human remains exhibited evidence of cannibalism. So in the first half of the 20th century, if there was a missing base of the skull, then people who were excavating assumed that there was some kind of cannibalism going on because the brain is it's just basically all fat. It's very nutritious. And if somebody was going to engage in cannibalism, they would preferentially potentially eat the brain. So anytime there was this missing skull base in the first half of the 20th century, they posited cannibalism as the cause for that. But now they found out that there could be other reasons because of the degradation process that the skull base might be missing, not just because somebody ate the brain or somebody excavated the brain that was another human. Also, there's other evidence for cannibalism. Myoglobin is a human, a protein that's uniquely in human muscle. And so what they've looked at with remains of human feces is that they found this protein in human feces, which is pretty much indisputable evidence of cannibalism. This is one of the big pieces of evidence for cannibalism in the American Southwest. But there's a author called Ahrens who wrote a book called The Man-Eating Myth, and he thinks that cannibalism is just overhyped and actually doesn't really happen very much. And there is a lot of evidence that societies will say that other members of other societies are engaging in cannibalism as a way, as just out of xenophobia or as a way of maligning them. But some kind of really misguided quote from him is, you would think in terms of evolution that if people ate each other, we wouldn't be around. It's not a good survival strategy or a way for a species to proceed. And obviously, evolution doesn't proceed through species survival, but evolution proceeds through individual survival. And so while it may be true that it would have been quite difficult maybe, for evolution of trust and cooperation to happen in humans if we were constantly eating each other, it isn't necessarily true that cannibalism is maladaptive in humans in most or all contexts. So I'm going to go through some different types of cannibalism that have been described. Survival cannibalism is pretty well known, and there's a lot of different stories written about survival cannibalism. Here on the left is a painting of La Méduse, which was a slave ship in the late 1800s, and there was this very small raft. I'm going to go through the whole thing that happened, that was set adrift with initially something like 120 people on it. And then on the right here, this is a picture of the discovery of the Uruguayan rugby team who were found in the Andean Mountains after being lost for potentially months, and they engaged in cannibalism to survive as well. So survival cannibalism, or cannibalism, has been called the custom of the sea because it has happened fairly frequently that boats would capsize or that people would be set adrift and they would have to engage in cannibalism at some point in order to survive until they were rescued, until they were found, or until they got to shore. And unsurprisingly, what you're meant to do if you arrive in one of these situations is to draw straws about who gets eaten. But unsurprisingly, who gets eaten is not random. Generally, the person who gets eaten is somebody who's in the out group, who has less allegiances with the group than other people. But once you're found or discovered, often you have to make some kind of rationalization about how the process by which you decided who was going to sacrifice themselves to the rest of the group was fair and equitable. So, for instance, on the Peggy, which was a slave, one of the slaves was cooked and eaten, and on the Méduse, in the Donner Party, which is a famous case in the United States of a caravan going westward, it was the Native Americans who were first meant to be eaten. But when they caught wind of this, they basically left the rest of the party. So I'm going to go through a few different cases of survival cannibalism. On the Méduse, this is a raft by 7 to 20 meters, which almost had 120 people, something like that, on the raft. And instead of having water, they were cut adrift from the longboats because there were just too many people and they didn't want people crawling onto the longboats. So these people were all set adrift, and instead of water, all they had was casks of wine. And so they were all drinking the wine, and as you can imagine, overnight, fights started to break out. And by the fourth day, there were only 64 people left on the boat. And by the eighth day, there was only 15. So they were either setting each other off the boat or eating one another, and they were rescued on the 12th day. The Essex was a whaling ship that was destroyed by a sperm whale, and they all set themselves out on rowboats to try to get to shore somewhere. sort of ironically, they could have sailed about 1,900 kilometers west to the Marquesas, but they decided not to do that because there was evidence or there was rumors that there were cannibals living there and that they would have ended up being cannibalized. So they decided to set off on a 6,000 kilometer journey where they ended up having to resort to cannibalism in order to survive. So at the end of that, only 2 men survived after 4 months of being adrift and cannibalizing each other. And they were so completely out of their minds by the time they were rescued, they didn't even recognize the rescuers as other human beings. In the Mignonette, which is a more recent case, there were only 3 people on an Australian ship, and a 17-year-old boy, he started drinking seawater, he got a little bit delusional, and the 2 other men who had families decided that they were going to kill him because he had no family and they were more important than him, essentially, is what they decided. So there was one of the only cases that's ever come to court, because oftentimes if people engage in cannibalism, it doesn't end up being a murder charge because it's kind of understandable that you have to do this to survive. But this is one of the few cases that actually went to court. So it was R. Dudley versus Stevens, and both of the men who ate the 17-year-old boy were actually sentenced to death, but the sentences were commuted to 6 months imprisonment without hard labor. Other cases of survival cannibalism: famine in China, where children and concubines were killed during the 594 BC siege of the Song capital, and also in the siege of Leningrad, where people didn't actually see other people eating people, but overnight there would be bodies laying out, and then there would be bits of the bodies removed by morning. So people didn't really know who was engaging in cannibalism, but that was there was such a food shortage that people were probably engaging in cannibalism in that case. And sort of interesting in the case of this Uruguayan rugby team in Alive, they were initially very reticent, of course, to eat one another, and they were eating their belts and various other things like that. And then one of the group decided to compare eating one another to taking the Eucharist, so the blood and body of Christ, and said, well, this is if our companions are watching us in heaven, they would really want you to eat them in order to survive. So that's how they ended up convincing one another that it was okay. And in almost all these cases, nobody ended up being convicted of anything. Homicidal cannibalism, which I'm not going to go about too much. I think this is sort of really morbidly strange. This is Jeffrey Dahmer made a little drawing here about how he wanted his house to look. So this is a black table, painted skulls, and this is like he wanted to have a whole shrine to his murder victims. So Jeffrey Dahmer was very famously an American who killed young men and found competent to stand trial. Albert Fish, another famous homicidal cannibalism, who cannibalized children. A more interesting and recent case was Armin Muse, who was a German man who achieved international notoriety for killing and eating a voluntary victim. So he looked around online. He wanted to find somebody. Actually, he wanted to find somebody much younger than the guy he ended up finding and cannibalizing. So he was looking for somebody under 40, but the guy he ended up cannibalizing was like 42. But anyway, this guy came over to his house. He gave him a bunch of painkillers and sleeping pills. The 2 of them ate his penis fried up together. And then the guy, the victim, whose name was Bernd Brandis, got in the tub and bled to death. And then Armin Muse ate his body over the course of a few months until he ended up being caught. In an interesting turn of events, Armin Muse, who's in prison still, has since become a vegetarian, and believes that there are about 800 cannibals in Germany. So because he's been, online and talking to other people, that's what he thinks is going on. Gastronomic cannibalism is just basically cannibalism because it tastes good. And I will just go ahead and say I got almost all of my source material for this section is from a very questionable book, which is... has a lot of kind of juicy anecdotes about cannibalism, including this one. A Maori chief named Tua was brought to London in 1818 for civilizing. It didn't go very well. He missed the feast on human flesh. He told scandalized dinner parties he was fed up with beef. He would then add, with a faraway look in his eyes, women and children. Now they were delicious. But remember to keep the fat from the buttocks, in particular, for dribbling on sweet potatoes. This is from A History of Cannibalism, which is an online book. Other ideas about why cannibalism has existed, like gastronomic cannibalism, has been because there are no large mammals to eat. So in Fiji, for example, rats are the largest mammal that Fijians would have to eat, and so the idea is they were simply eating other human beings because there was no other red meat to eat. That's another similar idea about Aztecs. Aztecs who had no domesticated large mammals to eat. One idea is that their sort of ritualized cannibalism, which I'm going to go into more in a second, wasn't just because of ritual, but it was also in order to complement their protein. The Mambilla sold their dead to neighboring tribes. Other tribes of both Africa and South America fattened up prisoners to take to market, often castrating them to speed up the process. Young boys were force-fed bananas and then baked and sold. In southern Nigeria, they were going market prices for different cuts of the human victim. In the Congo, lines of men and women, potential meals were led around, their bodies marked up with colored clay for purchasers to choose the cut. When an enraged European protested, the trader in question looked bemused. But that is not a man, he said. It is a slave, beef. So in some tribes, like the Myanmar and New Guinea, they basically consider, this is what anthropologists have reported, they consider those in the outgroup, those other members of other tribes, as their quarry, as their game. They don't really consider them other humans so much as possible meat to eat. This is the Bafambasa of West Africa tortured their prisoners by forcing boiling palm oil into their stomach and bowels. The supposed reason for the dual enema was to make the flesh more succulent. The hideous pain was just a bonus. So these are all juicy anecdotes of dubious validity that I found through various sources. But if you don't want to engage in cannibalism, but you want the taste of human flesh, there's always hufu, which is what vegan cannibals eat. And that is the healthy human flesh alternative. So Hufu was a website that came up several years ago, and it apparently was supposed to sell tofu that tasted like human flesh. And it went viral, but it ended up not being the real thing. That's why this person who sent me a care package wasn't able to actually put Hufu in there, but just other spiced tofu. So how does human flesh taste? In Melanesia, they call human flesh long pig because it's very much similar to pork, apparently, but much longer. Reading around, I also heard it compared to veal, but not to chicken, surprisingly. Is eating other human beings really a good thing from a nutritional perspective? So this is from a paper. I wish I had put the name of the paper here. This is a paper from the 1970s about the nutritional value of cannibalism. For a group of 100 people from New Guinea, assume the group kills one 60-kilogram man. The victim would yield 18% protein with 95% digestibility, yielding some over 10,000 grams of protein, or a dressing out protein, that's after you've made all the cuts, of 6,000 grams. Eating one man per week would satisfy almost 35% of the group's protein requirement, and 1 man per month would be 8% of the protein requirement for the group. So it actually looks like there's some, good nutritional value of cannibalism, and in this particular case, they're just showing, how more digestible human protein is than potentially other proteins, including plant proteins. Other kinds of cannibalism: ritual revenge and medicinal cannibalism. So, as I mentioned before, this is an Aztec painting or a rendition of an Aztec painting. There's this idea that the Aztec had to complement their diets with human flesh because they didn't have any large mammals, and apparently they called human flesh man corn. But also, there's other medicinal cannibalism that happens even today. In South Africa, not the country, but in the southern regions of Africa, albinos are often killed and made into preparations in order because they supposedly have medicinal properties. There's also lots of stories in China about people giving themselves altruistically for medical purposes. So there's a famous story about a young woman who cuts off a strip of her thigh and makes it into a soup for her father, who's miraculously healed from his illness. So there's a lot of stories about human flesh being used for that purpose. In terms of cannibalism, survival cannibalism is interesting because people tend to eat the less personal parts of people last. So they try and eat things like thighs and organs and things first, and then they want to eat like faces and hands and genitals last because that's the more personal parts of the person. Whereas if you look at something like revenge cannibalism or cannibalism that's thought to have magical properties because you're getting the strength of the person that you are eating, that's in those cases people tend to eat the more personal parts of the person first, like the heart and the hands, in order to gain their qualities. There's also been some. I'm going to talk about baby eating in a second, actually, so don't want to jump the gun on that. Funerary cannibalism. So this is the Wari tribe, and among the Wari, they will let the body decompose somewhat, and then they make kind of a soup, and everybody eats it together, and it's sort of a grief process that they engage in together. And a quote from one of them is, "It's better to be inside a warm friend than buried in the cold earth." So funerary cannibalism is not super common, but it has been documented among the Wari and also among the Foray, which I'm going to talk more about in a second. But they think that there's this indignity to decaying that they want to avoid by eating their loved ones. And this is a form of endocannibalism, so that is eating members of one's own, in this case, one's own family. Among the Foray, they actually will take their dead and they make a paste out of the ashes of the dead and banana to eat. But there's this disease that's been found among the Foray called Kuru, and it's also been called laughing disease, and it's a neurodegenerative disease. So I don't know if anybody here is familiar with prions, but prions are proteins, and they're sort of they're not a virus, but they are a pathogenic entity. And essentially what they do is they get into your neural tissues and they cause your proteins to fold differently than the way they're supposed to fold. So this is a normal brain here, and this is a brain with Kuru. And you can see in Kuru, this is just a neurodegenerative disease. The prions that you've eaten from another, like through the funerary ritual, end up refolding and causing holes in your brain. This is Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease in the lower left-hand corner, which is another neurodegenerative disease, and that's scrapie, which is a neurodegenerative disease among sheep. So prions became really famous several years ago, I don't know, maybe decades ago now, because of bovine spongiform encephaly, or mad cow disease, where cattle were being fed basically the slaughterhouse scraps of other cows, and they were getting mad cow disease because of these prions. And probably everybody saw videos of cows unable to stand, completely losing their ability to coordinate themselves because of this neurodegenerative disease. So among the Foray, what happens is the maternal kin are responsible for dismembering the corpse. The women remove the arms and the feet, and they strip the limbs of muscle and remove the brain and cut open the chest. Because the brain is so fatty, the brain was preferentially fed to elderly people and to young males. And Kuru was really had a tremendous impact on the Foray. So, for instance, it was killing about 1 to 2% of the population per year. And in some villages, there would be very few young women because it would be young women who were preferentially preparing the bodies to be eaten. So the Kuru epidemic reached its height in the 1960s, having recorded over 1,100 deaths. And it was a medical mystery that actually didn't know what was going on for a long time. And there are quite a few videos online of people that are affected by Kuru. I just didn't put it in this presentation because it is just incredibly sad, because these people can't even walk or can't even talk, and they just have these constantly sort of changing facial expressions. So Simon Mead came out with this paper, I think this is a paper from 2008 in Philosophical Transactions, and showing that there's been positive balancing selection for a gene that, if you're heterozygous on this gene, essentially, it makes Kuru affect you later on in life than if you're homozygous on this gene. So this is heterozygosity at codon 129 in elderly men and women stratified by date of birth. And you can see the difference here in when the heterozygosity reached its peak, because women tended to eat the brains when they were in young adulthood, whereas males tended to eat the brains when they were still children. So males were exposed as infants at the peak of the epidemic in the 1950s, whereas females were exposed throughout life. And in 1960, cannibalism was outlawed, I think by the Australian government. So, yeah, you can see that this kind of balancing selection. And Mead actually went on to make a case that you can see balancing selection or evidence of cannibalism throughout human societies, because there's two different ways of two different kinds of heterozygosity, which is having one of each different gene that prevent prion diseases. So the case that he made was that if you look throughout different human societies, the way that they sampled genetics basically, is that there's evidence that there's an above chance likelihood that people are immune to these different kinds of prion diseases. And he said that because human flesh is the only flesh that we've all eaten in common throughout human history, this is evidence that cannibalism has been widespread throughout all of human history. I'm not going to go too much into this because there's a lot of controversy around it, and also because I don't understand it that well. but basically, there's a paper that came out just a couple years ago saying that Mead's results are bunk because he only sampled a very small proportion of the population, and it's not, and that his sampling was biased. And then Mead came out with another paper saying that his initial findings hold. But this was a really big deal when this came out. I think it was back in 2003, where there was all of these news headlines saying there's evidence for widespread cannibalism throughout the human species over time. And especially, this is Japan, Africa, Papua New Guinea, and this is like two different European samples. So this D value is how far away from what you would expect this heterozygosity is. So in these specific societies, there's this evidence for balancing selection of cannibalism. I'm going to briefly go into cannibalism used to malign different groups of people. So I was talking before about all these different reports of cannibalism. Cannibalism has been used throughout history as a way of saying that certain groups are less than human. This is a painting from, I think from Poland back in the 1800s, of the blood libel. So the blood libel was this idea that Jews used children they use their blood for their feasts on high holidays. So this is a painting of some Jewish people preparing babies and young children for a feast. On the right here is a painting or a picture from about the 1800s of Chinese people in San Francisco preparing a big soup pot of human beings. So this kind of thing, this alleged cannibalism has been used in malign groups a lot. And recently, actually in the last year, it's been said that Chinese eat human babies for medicinal purposes. So there was this picture floating around online of this guy, looked like he was eating a human baby, but it actually was a duck carcass with a doll head stuck on the end of it. In Snopes, you can see that. But, if you're going to eat other human beings, it kind of makes sense to eat babies because they have, they're going to be less diseased, they're going to be more tender, and, a variety of other reasons, really. So Mob's proposal was Jonathan Swift suggested that the Irish might eat their babies. Babies aren't diseased, babies are tender, babies won't fight back, and babies are much less noisy after you eat them. I don't know if you know that. Also, I don't know if you've ever seen people nibble on a baby's toes. That's what I would think is baby eating foreplay, actually. So this is a quote from Swift. "I have been assured by a very knowing American of my acquaintance in London that a young, healthy child, well nourished, is at a year old the most delicious, nourishing, and wholesome food, whether stewed, roasted, baked, or boiled, and I make no doubt that it will equally serve as a fricassee or a ragout." So a lot of these pictures are from Anne Geddes, who's this famous baby photographer, and she really is a great source of ways that you could prepare babies. These are other ways you could prepare babies. Watermelon, maybe you would dunk a baby in your tea, or eat a baby out of a chocolate egg. Oh, and this is the picture that I was talking about, where this guy, this is allegedly a man eating a baby. And yeah. So cannibalism also happens a lot in science fiction. Probably everybody's seen this or has heard about this film called Soylent Green, which is about a society in which overpopulation has taken over to such an extent that people are given great incentives to commit suicide. And then there's this great new product on the market called Soylent Green. I hate to spoil a film for you from the 1970s, but Soylent Green is people. And this is this really funny Simpsons advertisement. Soylent Green, now with more girls, because everybody knows that it's more delicious that way. This is To Serve Man. There's a science fiction. It's actually not cannibalism, but it's a 1950s Twilight Zone episode in which aliens come to Earth. They're doing great things for us, improving our agriculture, etc. And there's this sort of Rosetta Stone book that people start to translate called To Serve Man. And they think it's a book from the aliens about how to best do good things for human beings. When lo and behold, they find out at the end of the Twilight Zone episode, To Serve Man is actually a cookbook. And then finally, I don't know if everybody's seen Amelie, but the same director who directed Amelie made this film called Delicatessen, which is about a boarding house in which this man takes boarders and then kills them for meat, because, again, a futuristic world in which there isn't enough meat to go around and not enough sandwiches at seminars. So I'm going to go through a couple other little things. There is a book by Carol Adams, which is about, what's it called? Sexual politics of meat, that's right. And she talks a lot about, she's a hardcore animal ethics person, but she also talks about how sexism often manifests in this way through looking at women not only as sex objects, but as potential food items. So this is a really famous Hustler cover where this woman is being ground up into sausage. And then this is a famous, well, famous to me anyway, because he's from Atlanta, hip-hop cover where Ludacris is apparently eating a woman's leg. So there's a lot of kind of cannibalistic imagery used in sort of, yeah. I mean, people have definitely used these kinds of images as saying that, talking about sexism being rampant in culture. So just to end, cannibalism in the future. This is on the left from a film called Daywalkers, which is a terrible film about how everybody's been turned into vampires and they have to use human beings, like the last non-vampire human beings, to create blood banks, and they're farming them for their blood. But one of the problems with in vitro meat, from an ethics perspective, is that you have to engage in repeated biopsies of the animals in order to have enough cells to grow in this medium. So I don't know if people have heard about in vitro meat, but in vitro meat, you have these slabs of cells that are being grown. They often have to be on essentially an electric medium, so that the muscles are activated, so that the muscles grow, so you can end up eating them. But the first lab-grown burger was eaten last month in London. And yeah, one of the ethical problems is that you have to repeatedly biopsy animals. So it could be, if you want to get past those kinds of constraints, that you could instead biopsy humans and you could make human lab meat instead of animal lab meat. So rather than growing a burger made of beef cells, or cow cells, you would grow a burger made of human cells instead. And that's all. This is me and my friend's placenta. Thank you.